So for tonight's talk, tonight's talk will be led by Los Alamos Resiliency, Energy, and Sustainability Task Force members. The members joining us this evening for this particular program are Katie Leonard, Sue Barnes, Robert Gibson, Chick Keller, and Steve Tobin. So the first person that will be speaking this evening is Katie Leonard. Katie, I'm going to go ahead and switch out this PowerPoint, and you can go ahead and turn on your screen and get started.
All right, thank you so much, Kristen. Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I'm Katie Leonard, Chair of the Los Alamos Resiliency, Energy, and Sustainability Task Force. We call it LARES because it's shorter. Our task force was formed from a citizen petition asking the County Council to take action on climate change. I'll highlight a few of our recommendations at the end of tonight's presentation. With me tonight are already introduced other members, so I will just skip that part. Next slide, please. As Kristen mentioned, this is the first of 3 events. You can go ahead and do the next slide too, that we are hosting through the peak. And here's what you can expect to get out of tonight's program. Why is the planet warming? Where did these greenhouse gases come from? What can I do? How can I help at the individual level? And we'll talk about how you can reduce your personal carbon footprint in several ways. I'll give some recommendation highlights, and then I'll give you information on how to contact lawmakers to advocate for change. Again, we'll be happy to take your questions at the end through the chat feature. Next slide, please. Thank you. We'll start with a little bit of climate change vocabulary. Not everybody knows what all the words mean, and we want to be sure everybody's on the same page. The first term is anthropogenic, and that's a fancy word for man-made. When you talk about climate change and emissions, there are some naturally occurring emissions that happen, but the big problem is this man-made these man-made emissions that have been happening over the past century or so. Photovoltaic, voltaic meaning electricity, photo meaning light. It's electricity produced from light. This is usually in reference to solar panels or rooftop solar, which is also often referred to as PV, photovoltaic. Greenhouse gases are what trap the sun's heat in Earth's atmosphere. We've got carbon dioxide, also CO2, same thing, methane, nitrous oxide, and fluorinated hydrocarbons. And each of these is detrimental and has heat trapping sort of properties, but they increase as you go down the list. So methane is worse than CO2, nitrous oxide is worse, and the fluorinated hydrocarbons are definitely the worst there. Ocean acidification isn't really something we deal with here in New Mexico, but it is something that's talked about a lot. It's basically when the ocean absorbs CO2 from the atmosphere and creates carbonic acid in the water, which lowers the pH, and that can inhibit the building of some creatures' shells and skeletons, and as well as other problems. So that's an issue. And then lastly, we have deforestation, and that's the cutting or burning of forests to make land for crops or buildings. It can also refer to cutting down trees for logging. So should you have other vocab questions like, oh, I heard this term in school and I don't know what it means, feel free to ask that at the end. Next slide, please. Knowing these terms should make the little video we're about to show easy to understand. This clip is from a series of videos from Project Drawdown. If you don't know that, that organization, it's amazing. They're the most comprehensive plan to reverse climate change that's out there. They have a fantastic series of little units you can watch for free online that are really informative and beautifully made. This particular clip is from Unit 2, and it gives an overview about global warming. And Kristen, if you could enable me to share my screen, please. And a thank you to Project Drawdown for their permission to show this video in public. Just waiting on permission to share my screen. Oh, good, I'm a co-host now. Oh, let me close out my email before I share my screen. Here we go. So I'm going to share, continue. Share sound. Okay, here we go. Please, somebody let me know if the sound does not come through properly.
So first of all, what are greenhouse gases? Well, you've heard a little bit about this before, I'm sure. You know that greenhouse gases kind of let in the sun's heat and they trap the Earth's heat as Earth is radiating out into outer space. So essentially they trap heat. And the more gases means the more heat. And that's why the planet's warming up. Pretty simple. There's a little bit more to it. It turns out that Earth already had greenhouse gases before we came along. There were natural greenhouse gases like water vapor, a little bit of carbon dioxide, and a few other things that have been there for millions, if not billions, of years of Earth history. But then we've got these things we call anthropogenic greenhouse gases, or human-caused greenhouse gases that we've been adding on top of that. And those include more carbon dioxide than was there before, more methane, more nitrous oxide. We've added chemicals that weren't even in the atmosphere before, like fluorinated gases, so-called chlorofluorocarbons, hydrofluorocarbons, and so on, and many other gases that are impacting our climate. And we can actually see how they've been rising over the last 100, 200 years. And especially in the last few decades, we have changed the nature of Earth's atmosphere and added a human greenhouse effect on top of natural greenhouse effect. And that's where we're getting into trouble. So what do these do? It's actually really simple physics. The idea is greenhouse gases are transparent. They let solar radiation, visible light, what we can see, right through them, like just a window. You can see right through it. But in infrared radiation, which you and I can't see, it is opaque. The infrared radiation is what Earth gives off to the rest of the universe, and so it can trap that heat in the atmosphere. It kind of works like this. Imagine a version of Earth with no atmosphere at all, like the moon. It would absorb the sun's radiation and warm up. The sun's heating the ground, and the ground would warm up. The ground, just obeying the laws of physics, would also give off heat or infrared radiation back to the rest of the universe, out to outer space. And without an atmosphere, this is what it would look like. The sun's heat comes in, Earth heat goes out, and they'd be in perfect balance, and we'd be at a temperature that would be accordingly in balance with that. But now let's add an atmosphere, a natural atmosphere. So we have what was the natural greenhouse effect. The idea is, as Earth is radiating its heat out into outer space, some of it would be absorbed by the air above it, and some of that would then be re-radiated back down towards the Earth's surface. That has the effect of making the Earth's surface a little bit warmer and the upper atmosphere a little bit colder. And that's exactly what Earth has had, and so are mainly all the other planets. Venus, Mars, and others also have a greenhouse effect kind of like that. But then humans come along and we add some more of those gases to the atmosphere. It'd be like adding another blanket on your bed in the wintertime. It traps more heat and keeps you toastier, a little bit warmer, and so on. And so this enhanced greenhouse effect traps a little bit more heat, radiates a little bit more down, and it warms the surface even more. And so far, we've warmed the planet about 1 degree Celsius. That doesn't sound like a lot. But think about it. During the last ice age, the planet as a whole was only 3 degrees colder than normal, and it was a totally different planet. This place was under about a mile of ice, in fact. We've warmed the planet in the other direction by about 1 degree so far, and we're going to keep going. If we keep going to another 2, 3, or 4 degrees, that could be a world we wouldn't even recognize. It would be very, very dangerous for our civilization. So where do these gases come from? Well, I'm sure you've already heard that a lot of them come from burning fossil fuels, right? Burning oil and natural gas and coal and petroleum substitutes and all these things that we have. And that is part of the story. Burning fossil fuels does create CO2, and that causes about 62% of the warming we see on the planet today. So if you forget about everything else, fossil fuels cause more than half of climate change. But that's not all. It turns out that CO2 is also produced by a few other things, including chemistry. In fact, a lot of our industrial processes, especially making cement, releases CO2 into the atmosphere without burning anything at all. It's just kind of industrial chemistry. We also release a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere by burning down trees and deforestation. This green area shows you how much CO2 is caused by burning down forest, which is kind of like burning coal. Coal's dead, trees are alive, but they're both made out of carbon. And you burn them in our atmosphere, you will make carbon dioxide either way. Then we have our next greenhouse gas of methane. Methane is produced by a whole bunch of different things, but the two big sources are agriculture and industry. In agriculture, which is about 2/3 of this methane emissions, is caused largely from cattle. And you've heard all the jokes before, I'm sure, about cow farts. Turns out that's not even true. Cows actually burp methane. They don't fart methane any more than other animals. The other third of this methane comes from industry, especially mining natural gas. Gas wells, fracking, gas pipelines, even coal mines release methane as well. So we have to think about energy and industry and agriculture to look at methane. Then we've got this stuff called nitrous oxide, which a lot of people don't even think about, but it's a big part of our climate change equation. And nitrous oxide, some of that comes from industry, but again, a lot of it comes from agriculture, especially using too much fertilizer or too much manure on our farmers' fields. And finally, we have F gases, or fluorinated gases, which are chemicals we use as refrigerants and sometimes as insulators in industrial processes. And those refrigerants, like chlorofluorocarbons and hydrofluorocarbons, are rising dramatically, and that's why we have to pay attention to this.
Okay. So I'm going to stop share. All right, so now we know where these gases come from and the impact they have. I will pass it over to Sue Barnes to continue. Take it away, Sue.
Thank you very much, Katie. And thank you for picking out such an excellent video to precede my talk and to get our conversation going about the sources of greenhouse gases in our lives. I'll wait till the slide comes along. And
you may need to advance a few. These were sort of backup in case the video didn't work. Okay, thanks.
Out there. Very good. Whoop, back one, please. Thank you. Excellent. So as the last video pointed out, our emissions aren't coming just from fossil fuel use, electricity generation, and natural gas use. They're actually diverse sources that we need to address. And this pie chart shows us an estimate of our greenhouse gas sources for Los Alamos residents. And in it, we can see that a goodly chunk of our emissions come from transportation fuel and from heating and electrical use in our homes, as you might expect. And we're going to be talking about these shortly. But if we look on the other side of the pie, we see that greenhouse gases are produced by almost everything that we buy and do. We call those emissions that result from the production of material goods and services embedded emissions. And we as consumers are responsible for those emissions. So for instance, there's those cow burps that were mentioned that release methane. And when we buy meat or dairy, we're effectively generating methane along with the carbon cost of the deforestation needed to produce meat and all the emissions that come from agriculture. Or let's talk about my lovely mug here. This was almost certainly fired in an electric or natural gas kiln. And so therefore, by buying this mug, I have effectively caused the emissions from the electricity production or the natural gas. Services also have emissions embedded in them. The healthcare industry, for instance, has a very big carbon footprint associated with it. So almost everything has a greenhouse gas cost to us. But the good news is that means we have many, many options to reduce our emissions in many ways every day. Next slide, please. In fact, Project Drawdown estimates that individual and household actions have the potential to produce as much as 30% of the total emissions reductions needed to avoid dangerous climate change. That's quite a big chunk. And we can see some of the most impactful actions listed here. I won't go into these in detail here, but you should see some that are familiar and perhaps not so familiar as ways of addressing emissions. A great thing about addressing these emissions is that we have the means and the power to address them right now. We don't have to wait for the development of carbon capture technology. We don't have to wait for policy change at the national level. And many of these things, many of these changes that we might make, like avoiding food waste, increasing walking, and changing what we eat, can have myriad economic, health, and social benefits to them as well. So it's a win-win kind of thing. But you may ask yourself, how do I find out about the greenhouse gases in my particular life? Next slide, please. Turns out there's an app, or a dozen or so, to do just that. There are a whole slew of what are called carbon footprint calculators out there that can help you understand where greenhouse gas emissions occur in your life and provide ideas on how to reduce them. And some of our task force members tried these out and came up with a couple that we can recommend. The first one, this Cool Climate Network Calculator, is from UC Berkeley, and it's web-based and it's quite good. But for those of you who like phone apps, you might want to check out the Earth Hero app. It not only calculates your carbon footprint for you and gives you ideas on how to reduce it, but it'll notify you every now and then, check in with you, see how you're doing, cheer you on, and that sort of thing. It's really pretty nice. For all of these, you basically put in the details of your life, such as how many miles you drive per year, in what kind of car, or how much natural gas you use to heat, how much food and other goods you buy, and so forth. The Cool Climate Calculator then gives you a graph like this one on the right-hand side of the screen that shows you where your greatest emissions are coming from. So, for instance, you may find, as I did, that the biggest greenhouse gases and emissions in your life come from car fuel, from the gas you put in your car, or maybe the next biggest source is natural gas or electricity that you use, and so on. These calculators are good for getting a rough estimate of your emissions and identifying the heaviest hitters, but may not be real precise in detail. But the main purpose of them is to give you ideas of what you can do to take action. Next slide, please. And the nice thing about these calculators is that they also give you suggestions on solutions. So if, for instance, I would like to reduce my transportation fuel use, the Cool Climate Calculator suggests that I might look into purchasing an electric vehicle. Or if I'd like to bring down my emissions from my electricity, I could look into purchasing green electricity, which we can actually do through Utilities Department, through the LA Green program, which allows me to pay a little extra for renewable energy credits. Or maybe I want to put solar panels on my house. At any rate, they give you a goodly list of suggestions of things that you can try and some idea of how much it might cost, how much CO2 it might save you, and so on. And then there are any number of other resources out there to help you reduce your carbon footprint. I just wanted to highlight one. It's a big, beautiful, brand new resource from the Drawdown folks called Project Nexus. It builds itself as the world's largest, most complete listing and network of solutions to the climate crisis and how to do them, and it delivers. I encourage you to check it out. It's absolutely beautiful, inspiring, and uplifting to read about all the ways that we can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and make the world a better place to live in. Next slide, please. But maybe you'd like a short list for starters. So I thought I'd prepare one. These are some of the most impactful changes that you can make, that any of us can make. Top on the list, my personal favorite, cut food waste. There are lots of different ways to do this. Everybody wastes food, and there are many ways to reduce it. And at the end of the presentation, we'll give you an opportunity to request a toolkit that we've prepared of tools to help you reduce your food waste, things like old school shopping lists, a storage guide on how to store your food properly, and so on. So cutting down on food waste is a very worthwhile thing to try to do for a number of reasons. Eat more veggies, basically cut down on meat and dairy, substitute in some of those healthier things that we should be all eating more of anyway. Insulate your home. Robert will be talking more about this in a minute, and I also think we're going to be offering that I know DPU has some energy conservation kits that they offer that can help you do some of these things. Refuse and reuse. You know, the lowest carbon thing you can buy is to not buy it in the first place, right? So if you can avoid buying something, you have avoided those emissions associated with buying that thing. See if you could repair what you have, or borrow from a friend, or rent, or reuse, or go to the thrift store. See what you can do to avoid buying things new. You can heat and cool smarter, get solar panels, drive an electric or hybrid, and I'll leave that to our other task force members to tell you more about. Get around greener. Think outside the single occupant vehicle and see if maybe you could get where you need to go by taking the bus or walking or riding a bike. Fly less or fly differently. There are many ways to modify our flying to use less fuel, and there's information on the internet about how to do that. And not last but certainly not least, reduce and recycle. Avoid using single-use plastic and recycle right. Next slide. And finally, maybe most importantly, take social, political, and economic action in support of the climate. Talk to your family and friends about climate change means to you. Don't try to blind them with science. Unless they ask you for facts, they probably don't want necessarily to know them. What they want to know is your story and how you feel about it and what you're doing about it. Those are the kinds of conversations to have with those people in your close social circles. Join a climate community. Climate Reality Northern New Mexico is a great local organization. 350.org is nationwide and has state chapters. They're very active in New Mexico. I would argue that much of what Peak does is focused or either focused or tangentially related to climate change, sustainability, and so forth. And really, there is no better place in town to volunteer and to support. And our Zero Waste team, Zero Waste Los Alamos, is all about reducing waste. And in the last few years, we've been focusing on reducing food waste in particular. And we'd love to have you join us as well. Get involved in peaceful protests. They can be fun. Work on climate as a career or volunteer. Help your town, the place where you work, your school, all take action on climate. Vote for people and policies that support the environment. Divest and maybe cut your ties to banks that support fossil fuel corporations. And the flip side of that is to invest in climate solutions. There are lots of ESG type investments now. The E part stands for environment. They can be fossil fuel free, and those types of investments are actually doing very well now. So check out what your 401k is invested in. Check out where your retirement funds are. Check out your banks. Donate to impactful organizations, and take care of yourself, your family, and your community, because we all help best when we are well. I hope this has given you some ideas of where to start in reducing greenhouse gas emissions in your life. You'll get more suggestions shortly. If you still find this a bit overwhelming, just start small. Do one action, make one change this week or this month. You don't have to drink from the fire hose here. Just take an action, make an action, and then keep going. And thank you for caring about climate change and the future of our world.
Okay, thank you very much, Sue. Next, we have Robert Gibson here to talk about other ways you can reduce your carbon footprint in your home, specifically with energy efficiency. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Katie. And thanks, Peak, for hosting this tonight. I'm going to talk about homes themselves and the appliances within them. Our homes use energy primarily in two forms: electricity and heating fuel. Heating fuel here is almost entirely natural gas. But we'll start with electricity. That's a little more familiar. And if we could have the next slide, please. There we go. Okay. Historically, electricity produces the most greenhouse gases that we are responsible for are produced by the electricity that we use, because coal was the biggest source. And we are rapidly moving away from coal. Utilities has a goal of being carbon neutral in our sources by 2040. Nevertheless, electrical energy efficiency remains very important. The less we use, the less carbon will be produced in a number of respects. The major uses are shown on the slide here. I think you're probably all familiar with them. There's nothing new. Power use by each one of these can be reduced either with more efficient replacements or simply reduced use. You're no doubt aware of what can be done, and there are many sources of information. So people have talked a lot about electricity in recent years. What they haven't talked about so much is natural gas. And natural gas also emits greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide when it burns, not as much as coal, but still quite a bit. And methane when it leaks directly into the atmosphere at the wellhead during transmission or in incomplete combustion. Since it is less well known and more challenging, I'm going to talk primarily about eliminating or at least reducing natural gas in our homes this evening. And don't panic. No one's proposing to force you to retire your furnace before it is ready to be replaced anyway. This is all going to take us decades. It's not going to happen tomorrow. We can start with newly constructed buildings, and they can be made much more efficient from the get-go. Architecture, orientation with respect to the sun, direct solar heating can all play a part in new homes and replacements for some of our older homes. And those things can reduce heat loss by 50% or more. But what can we do about existing homes? Next slide, please. The keys here to reducing natural gas in our homes are really, it's all summarizable in 3 words. One is insulation, and the other 2 are heat pumps. We'll start with insulation. But I ask you, remember these 3 words, because that's, if you don't remember anything else from this talk, that's those are the keys. First with insulation, and on the next slide. There we go. Homes lose heat from all sides. This cartoon represents a very average heat loss in a typical house. You see, there's no one direction that dominates. Each home is different. To reduce the heat loss or the heat gain in hot weather, which is another consideration, all sides need to have good insulation. And we also need tight, energy efficient windows and doors. Even the best windows and doors do not insulate nearly as well as walls. The old single pane windows, for instance, are effectively a hole in the wall for heat to escape. The 40s and 50s government homes here had very little wall insulation and single pane windows. They also often had flat roofs with little insulation and uninsulated crawl spaces. Later, privately built homes were better, but most still have room for improvement. Many older homes have been remodeled to varying degrees. Improved insulation should be a major consideration for any future remodeling plan. For more comfort, certainly, and reduced utility bills and reduced CO2 emissions. Closely related to insulation is infiltration or air leakage. And that's the leaks you get around windows and doors, where utilities enter the buildings, and failed seams and siding, through old and faded caulking, and numerous other places. Hopefully the leaks aren't bad enough that you can feel them, but thermal imaging can certainly identify such leaks. And oftentimes those fixes are fairly cheap and easy. No matter how tight the envelope is, however, and we don't want it too tight, you still need to have some fresh air coming in. Buildings still need a heat source. And even with the best passive solar heating today, they still need an artificial heat source. And that need can best be met today with heat pumps. Next cartoon, please. Next slide, I'm sorry. Heat pumps may or may not be a familiar term, but they're a well-established technology. Air at any temperature above absolute zero contains heat energy. And heat pumps extract that energy from the cooler air, and they pump it uphill, if you will, to a warmer area. Refrigerators and air conditioners are heat pumps. They can be made reversible. Heat pumps can pump in either direction. Perhaps the best known example of that is the through the wall units that heat many hotel and motel rooms that we're used to staying in. Those are reversible heat pumps, and they've been around a long time. There are several new developments in town that are being built today with heat pumps instead of with gas heat. Heat pumps are electric, but they make much more efficient use of electricity than traditional, very expensive electric resistance heating, typically around 3 to 5 times more efficient use. And so that today, even they're comparable to gas in utility cost. And those comparisons are likely to get even more favorable. A big thing is that since they are reversible or can be made reversible, heat pumps can also provide air conditioning, something that's getting increasingly important here as our summers get hotter for longer. And as more people moving to Los Alamos expect air conditioning. We're not so used to it in our traditionally here, but people coming in think they ought to have it. Heat pumps are not a direct substitute for existing furnaces and boilers. Changeover will take planning and time, so it's best done before that old furnace fails in the winter. Yes, they're more expensive than a simple replacement furnace, but you get air conditioning too. Okay, next slide, please. Space heating is not the only use of natural gas. It's by far the biggest, but not the only one. Water heating is a major use in homes that use natural gas water heaters. These too can be replaced with heat pumps. Standalone units exist just for water heating, but it would usually be more cost and energy efficient to combine water and space heating in a single integrated system. As with electric heat, heat pump water heating uses much less electricity than traditional electric water heaters. So you can, that water heater, even if you got an electric, it can be made more efficient by converting to a heat pump also. There are other approaches to heating water. Solar is, of course, an obvious one. Tankless or point of use electric water heaters are others. Which will be best for a given home? That's going to vary. And every property in town's going to be different. Then there's the gas cook stove. There's a substitute for this too. The electric induction stove. Compared to gas and traditional electric stoves, it heats food faster. It allows much more precise temperature control. It uses less energy, and it reduces the risk of burns. It's kind of a win-win-win-win-win situation. They cost little more than traditional ranges, although there can be costs for upgrading wiring if your kitchen is not already wired for electric stove, and possibly for replacing some of the cookware for compatibility. It does require some slightly different cookware. Last but definitely not least is the lowly gas pilot light. Those burn 24/7 and usually 365, and it may account for around 5 to 10% or more of our gas use. Most newer gas appliances use electric igniters. Some older units can be retrofit with electric igniters before the unit itself is replaced. Besides the global environment, the indoor air environment will be better without gas also. In addition to CO2, burning gas produces traces of carbon monoxide, nitrous oxides, sulfur dioxide, formaldehyde, and other toxic gases. And of course, without gas, the danger of fire or even explosion is eliminated. Also eliminated is the threat of being without gas for extended periods of time. And we mean really extended, like perhaps weeks following a major gas outage while utility crews go house to house relighting pilot lights. It does happen. So making our homes more energy efficient and all electric will take time. And it will require the engagement eventually of every property owner in town. So we need to get started. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Robert. Some of you, oh, sorry, wrong one. Next, we have Chick Keller, who has some other information on climate change, as well as information on residential rooftop solar. So Chick, you can turn on your camera and unmute and take it away.
Hi there. Rooftop solar is quite an interesting thing in the future, to the extent that we're really going to get off natural gas in the long run and get onto electricity. It's an excellent way to do that. We get a lot of sun, and there's an increasing number of people in the country who are really getting excited about rooftop solar. There's lots of projects for doing it. Schools are doing it, what have you. And so it looks like a really good idea. And there are enough people in town who are doing it now that if you have questions, you can always talk to them about some of the details, because there's a few things that you need to know about. But if you look at this carbon budget, if we're really going to keep our global warming to 1.5 degrees, look how fast we have to drop the carbon. It has to be really fast, and we have to do everything possible. One of the ways to do it, of course, is to produce electricity from the sun. Next slide. Next, yeah. If you look at sort of the rough distribution of where all the energy is used, it's in transportation, get yourself that electric car, power, really big, and then residential. So the residential is not inconsequential. It's because, of course, there's so many of us, but each one of us can make a difference there. Next slide. And what's the threat? As the climate models 20 years ago predicted, the temperature of the Earth is going to go up, especially in the south and southwest. And you can see a good example of that in the left picture. That's our June to August temperature departure over the 20th century average. And it goes up to as much as 5 degrees weatherman temperature, Fahrenheit. And the result, as the climate models pointed out, is you get real big droughts in the West. Because the East is affected by the Gulf of Mexico, it's not so bad, but in the West, it's pretty bad. And you can look there and see that our area is in an area of extreme drought right now, has been for a while. And there doesn't seem to be any reason to think that that drought will quit. And one of the reasons is when you do get rain, as they were just doing in Los Angeles, you get a whole lot of rain at one time. It all runs off. And because the temperature's elevated, it evaporates too. So the ultimate effect is even for the same amount of rain or a little more, you get drier soil. And there are predictions that say, look, in about 20 years, there won't be many ponderosas around Los Alamos because it will have just gotten too dry. If we want to slow that down, we need to get to work on it. It's really happening. Next slide. Here's a look at the temperatures. One is the yearly temperatures from 1880 up to the present. And you can see there that the much ballyhooed stopping of rising temperatures. I said it was really funny. When the Democrats got in under Obama, the temperatures stopped going up. But it didn't really, it just sort of slowed down for a minute, and you can see it's just racing farther up. Due to the La Nina, it's about in here right now, but this rise looks like it's increasing, not just going up linearly. And that again is also predicted. Here are our decadal results. This is not good. This is a warming which we really need to do something about. Go ahead. Next slide. So 2 things here. These panels down here, this is my house, heat hot water. They have a little photovoltaic plate over here that only runs the pump on this when the sun's out, because if it were running when the sun wasn't out, you'd be pumping cold water down into your tank. And so it's an automatic, runs all by itself. You don't have to pay any attention to it at all. And it collects a large amount of heat and heats up the water for you, essentially for free. Up here are the electric photovoltaic panels, and we'll talk more about those. So let's go to the next slide. Once you put those panels in, down in your garage, you're going to have a little indicator like this, and it shows how much energy you're getting during the day. So this is 9 o'clock in the morning up to 1 or 2 o'clock and then back down. Here's the next day going up. Tells you how much power you're getting, how much you were getting for the day, and gives you this total. And you can change the screen to see a bunch of other things. So not only can you do this, you can actually monitor what's going on. Next slide. One of the interesting things, people say, well, solar only works during the daytime, from about 9 in the morning till about 5 or 6 in the afternoon, while the peak energy for most of the year is when people come home from work and turn on everything, and it goes up there. So here's our peak solar production, but what are we going to do about this? There are two answers to that. One of the answers is, of course, that as it heats up, people are going to start running air conditioners in this part of the day, and that's going to drive this curve up and move the peak, at least part of it, over here. What about when the sun goes down? That's the next thing we want to talk about. Next slide. Whoops, maybe that's the slide we have. I'll just talk about a few things. What we really need to do here is look at why we have solar. We have solar for the reasons we've talked about there, but there are two other ones that are really important that people haven't probably thought much about. Outages. So it's the middle of the afternoon, you have a power outage. Those people who have PV on their roofs can just keep on running. They don't have to worry about the power outage. The other thing is solar can help with this peak demand over here. And how do you do that? You do it with storage. Each home should have some sort of battery storage in its garage, so that during the peak time, you store the batteries, and then when you want, for the peak sun, and then when the sun's down, these batteries can give the energy back. That's really an important thing, because the county can use that to cut off having to buy peak power. Peak power, your utility bill is an average of what power costs all day long, but it costs a different amount at different parts of the day, depending on how much energy is wanted. But when it gets to peak power, the grid people turn on special heating gas systems and this and that, and they charge a lot of money for peak power. If we can knock the top off the peak power by being able to provide to the county stored solar energy, your utility, everybody's utility bill comes down. And we really have made a big difference, because we're not using fossil fuels to provide that peak power. Well, how can we do that? The first thing you have to know, this is just a little detail, is right now for most solar on the roof, if there's a power outage, the utility people don't want the power going out from your PV onto the grid, because that would endanger the safety of the people working to get the outage back. But in doing that, the way they've set it up is they cut off the power to anything. So the whole solar thing just doesn't do anything. So if you're going to put power in, make sure you can get that extra switch that will just cut off the power going to the grid, but won't cut it off to your house. The other way, of course, is storage. And storage is expensive. It's a problem. And so we're looking at communities, small communities, much like ourselves in Vermont, Green Mountain Power. And what they did was something very innovative. You wouldn't think about it, offhand, but once you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Have the county purchase storage and install it in your home, and they pay for it. What you then do is pay a monthly service charge for that, for the fact that it's there. It has the advantage that everybody has storage, so the county can make use of it, you can make use of it. And not only that, it's all standardized. It's exactly, the electronics and the equipment is exactly the way the county needs it to optimize what they're doing. I urge you to support this initiative in Los Alamos. it's not as if we have to try it out. It's already being done. We already know how to do it. And it pays for itself very quickly, 10 years or something like that. And this, I think, is the most important thing, because if you just have PV on your roof and you don't have any storage, your effect on the total electricity and even on yourselves is much reduced. We really need to have storage. And the way to do that is to have the county buy it for you and then essentially charge you some money for it. So I urge you to support that. So that's all the stuff I want to talk about in terms of rooftop solar. It's really nice. It's easy to do. You'll be delighted that you have it. And especially if you get an electric car, which we're now going to hear about, you can charge your electric car with that solar too, because you can pick when you do it. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you, Chick. Steve Tobin is next to talk about EVs. If you have questions, note them and save them for Zoom at the end. Go ahead, Steve.
Hello. So when Katie asked me to talk about electric vehicles, I thought, okay, know your audience. And so I'm going at this with the perspective that someone who doesn't have an EV will have a lot of questions, since it's a noticeable change from an internal combustion engine. And so I thought, I've had one for 6 years. I have an ESun Leaf, and I made a list of a lot of the things that I've found interesting and helpful as I've gone through being an EV owner. And as I mentioned, I have a Nissan Leaf. I would start off saying how much we love our Leaf, but I would also say it's probably one of the arguably worst cars out there. Why? Because it has about the lowest range of any EV, and they didn't temperature control it, the battery, and so therefore it oscillates a fair amount in its performance relative to other EVs. But that having been said, it's still a wonderful car. I end up charging about every other day. I would say there's been extreme improvement in EVs. To comment on a few other available options today, you can get a Chevy. Most car companies are now offering around a 250-mile range vehicle, and those are often in the range of $35,000 to $40,000. And some basic things about electric vehicles, you might want to know how many motors they have. Most have one motor that attaches to an axle and drives 2 of the wheels, but they also are some that have 2, 3, and 4. I was surprised to learn that some have 3 motors. So depending on the speed you want or some of the flexibility that comes with other additional motors. I looked up some stats of how people with EVs behave. So Consumer Reports states that for those people that have a car that has a 250-mile range, in general, they charge at home 92% of the time. And that's one of the things that I think many people who don't have an EV are afraid of getting stranded. And it's just amazing once you begin to realize that your house is your gas station, and you can fill it up every night if you want. And so after you had one for a while, you really kind of lose your range anxiety, I would say. I thought I'd give a few stats on the efficiency of the car. So my Nissan Leaf, for example, I get about 113 miles to the gallon, where for that calculation, I've assumed gas is 3.25 a gallon. And when I first got, I was kind of amazed how efficient the vehicle was when I first got it. And you kind of come to appreciate that it's so efficient in comparison to internal combustion engines. It's more so that internal combustion engines are so bad. They're around 25% efficient, where an electric vehicle is around 85%, meaning 85% of the energy you put into it, it goes into the axle turning. A couple other things on the economics surprised me. I largely charge at home, so I'm getting 11.5 cents a kilowatt hour. It was interesting to do a little research on what you pay when you do charge away from home. So Tesla superchargers are about double what your home rate is. And I looked up on some other charging infrastructure, and you can get much higher. Blink apparently can get as high as 3 to 7 times what your house rate is. So they can go up, but even if it's double, like with a Tesla supercharger, if a Tesla's getting about 90 miles to the gallon, so you're getting about 45 miles to the gallon for that double rate. So it's still quite reasonable on a cost per mile basis. And I also mentioned Lanol's added a number of chargers recently, and Lanol barely adds an additional cost to pay for the infrastructure, something like 10% above that 11.5 cents a kilowatt hour that we in Los Alamos County pay. Another thing that was interesting, I think most people are used to from internal combustion engines, that the car is most efficient on the highway. And one of the things to be prepared for, the electric vehicles, it's kind of the opposite. They're most efficient in city driving. And there's a number of reasons for that, regenerative braking and the gear ratios that are in internal combustion cars, and that friction goes as v squared, as velocity squared, as you go faster. It's a greater part. So all that combined, basically, you need to get used to that the range will be less on an electric vehicle when you're on the highway compared to city. Another thing I thought I'd mention is, why do people often say it takes so much X amount of time to get to 80% charge? And the reason that's mentioned is because the charging of an electric vehicle is not linear. And by that I mean it charges the percentage, like you gain 10% initially pretty quickly, and as you get closer to 100%, the rate at which the energy, the percentage of charge goes up is slower. So 80% is sort of an optimum range for if you're doing a road trip. Okay, a few more facts. So people are often also curious about the health of a battery. The batteries aren't so fragile. The manufacturers have built in intelligent computer control so that you don't destroy your battery. But a general recommendation is not to overcharge it or undercharge it, and so deplete it very far. So for typically healthy use of a battery, would go to 20% charge to 80% and stay in that range. You also don't want to cycle it a huge amount of time. But the main thing is, if you have a long trip, sure, go to 100% and deplete it and discharge it lower. You're not going to have a noticeable degradation, but over the long run, you're going to want to stay in an intermediate range for best battery health. On the topic of battery health, I did a bit of research. So as I mentioned, the Leaf is probably one of the worst batteries. And what I've noticed in our car in 6 years is that we've lost about 10% of our capacity, and that's going 36,000 miles. We just used the Leaf really in Los Alamos County. But I looked up on Tesla's, they're quoted at being around a 5% loss over 100,000 miles. And the Bolt is around 7% loss over 100,000 miles. So they are rather robust. You hear of people replacing batteries on Leafs, but most cars now probably will never replace their battery. And that quality is continuing to improve as we gain more experience. And there's often the same, I think electric battery, from the things I've heard and research I've listened to, we're about at break even on whether an internal combustion engine equal to an EV over its life. Now, in making that statement, there's 3 key things to mention. Right now, if you buy a Bolt, it's about 10K over the non-electric version. And so how do you make up the 10K over the lifetime? Really 3 ways. One, I've already mentioned, the much better miles per dollar. The other is that an internal combustion engine propulsion has about 2,000 moving parts as part of the propelling the vehicle, where an electric car is like 20 just in the propulsion. And because of that, the electric cars last, or are expected to last much longer. So a longer lifetime, more, and also 70% less maintenance, because there's not much that can break in the propulsion system. So few more facts. One of the questions that is often asked: can you use the battery to run your house off of? And so one thing to mention in that context is that a Bolt type vehicle has like 2 days of energy storage of the average house. But almost all cars, all that I know of, are not designed to be plugged into a house. It would be a great use to the grid if there could be some give and take from the vehicles. But in general, to my knowledge, several have the ability to plug in appliances to them, but they're not designed to be use their full capacity to connect to a house. And last few points, I would also add a point on safety. One of the things that's been frustrating to me as someone who really has valued having a high efficiency gas car is that you often had to take a safety hit when you got a gas car, smaller, lighter. And so when you collided with a bigger vehicle, you were the loser. With electric vehicles, they're rather heavy. and they have a much lower center of mass. So there's a safety gain for electric vehicles. One last comment is that the Atomic City Transit is purchasing 2 EV buses, and that the county is interested in buying more EV vehicles for county use. And I say that would be it. All yours, Katie.
Okay, thanks a lot, Steve. I will try to summarize the LARES task force recommendations as quickly as I can. These are recommendations that are going to County Council. Our final report is due in February. We've been working on this for a year, and these are things we think will work for our community. You'll notice that we have 6 categories of recommendations below, and not all recommendations are listed tonight. This is kind of the highlights. Next slide, please. Some of the general recommendations include officially establishing a net zero emissions goal for the county, performing a baseline emissions study, and then creating a climate action plan with reduction targets based on those data. We'd like to see an annual update to the community, like the annual water quality report that you receive in the mail. And we're also recommending a sustainability coordinator position to facilitate this work. Next slide, please. For natural gas reduction, we're recommending natural gas reduction targets and determining a date and new hookups in construction. Encouraging non-natural gas appliances, which were mentioned earlier. New construction must have solar access, and that the county should provide some home energy audit residents to help make homes more energy efficient. A lot of people want to make changes, but don't know where to start. Next slide. In terms of electricity supply and demand, we have recommendations centered around looking at carbon-free power sources, rooftop solar and storage, and the Los Alamos County and Lanel Power Agreement. Next slide. When it comes to transportation, we recommend increasing and incentivizing public transportation ridership and carpooling, developing an EV charging infrastructure, increasing the number of EVs in all the fleets in the county, and improving bicycle lanes and paths for transportation, including a bike path between White Rock and Los Alamos that's not on the main road. For building planning and zoning, adopting new and updated codes, advocating for a loan program through the utilities to make energy efficient retrofits in existing construction. Many other places have programs like this, and they're really successful and beneficial for all parties. There's a little snag with the New Mexico anti-donation law, which we're trying to figure out a way to get around. And then educating homeowners to replace single pane windows and adding attic insulation. Next slide. Our last category is based on waste consumption and natural resources. So we're trying to eliminate as much municipal waste as we can, 100% in theory, through reduction, reuse, recycling, and composting. We want to educate the community on your own carbon footprint so you can reduce your own emissions. Updated plans for water conservation, watershed stewardship, and with stormwater runoff, and managing natural areas, and including carbon sequestration. That's the really brief version. I encourage you to read our final report once it's out. The success of these recommendations depend on community support and action. Speaking of, I'd like to encourage you to contact your local, state, and national lawmakers to advocate for policy change. Policy matters. This is how big change is made, and they need to hear from you. We can send you these slides if you'd like any of this information, particularly the emails or anything else that you saw in the presentation tonight. Next slide. Moving on to questions. If you do have a question, please type in the chat. I realize we've gone over time a little bit, and I apologize. We'll try to get to as many as we can without going too long. You're also welcome to contact LARES with any further questions or comments. We'd love to hear from you.
Okay. That was a lot to get through, and I thought it was very good, very efficient, good information. Okay, so we do have a question that was asked earlier on. What are relative costs of space heating and water heating by heat pumps compared to using modern natural gas boilers / heaters?
Robert, do you want to take that one?
Of course, it depends on what the cost of gas is, what the cost of electricity is, and the cost of gas fluctuates quite a bit and probably will go up somewhat, but it's the best answer I can give to that today is it's roughly comparable, because heat pumps are much more efficient than traditional resistance electric heating. So when you fold that much better efficiency in, they wind up being close to each other. Now that in any given time, that might be 10, 20, 30, 40% one way or the other, but somewhere in the same ballpark.
Awesome, thank you. So we have a lot of comments about how great the information was. People want the slides, and I think since we have them, I'll switch them to PDF and send them with the evaluation email, if that's okay. Okay, we do have, oh yeah, Peak did do a heat pump talk back, I think a couple months ago, and that is recorded. If you would like to know more about that, that is on our YouTube. Okay, are there four-wheel drive vehicles, four-wheel drive electric vehicles? I think that's what that means.
Let me answer that. And Steve probably knows too, but I've got a Tesla. It gets 340-mile range and it's four-wheel drive. And boy, this last snowstorm, my Prius wouldn't come up my driveway and the Tesla just went up the driveway like it was summer. Also, you'll probably never need to replace your brakes because you never use them. The regenerative braking, all the way down the hill to the top, you never touch the brakes.
Wow, that's pretty
Anything
impressive.
you want to add, Steve?
Good enough.
Very good. Then yes, there are. Any other questions out there in the audience? We'll give it a second. Okay. Awesome. Thank you so much for every member of the task force for joining us this evening that was able to be here and able to present. I know there's many more of you, but thank you for being here with us.